Started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Erin Moss, and I am a member and the volunteer chancellor at St. James Cathedral in Chicago. I'm also the board secretary here at EPN, where the church gathers. We're happy to welcome you to this workshop discussing how to measure and manage conflict before it impacts and potentially even derails your important work. Just a couple of procedural items before I turn everything over to our panel. First, this session is being recorded. You will receive an email with a link to the recording and any additional materials provided by the panelists once they post to our website's workshop library. We try to get this out within 24 to 48 hours. I can't stress the importance of the workshop library. It's an excellent source of pre-recorded webinars, including this one, on a wide variety of topics. I highly encourage you to go check it out and find additional resources to assist you in your parishes. Also, the Q&A function is disabled for all of our workshops. Please enter your questions in the chat, and the panel will answer them during and after the session as time permits. A transcript of the chat will be available on the workshop library alongside the recording. Again, thank you all for being here. I'm now happy to introduce Jess Schultz, Chief Partnership Officer at the Colossian Forum, who will start the discussion and introduce the rest of our panel. Jess, over to you.
Thanks, Erin. It is a delight to be with all of you today. I imagine because you knew what you were coming to, it doesn't shock you to have the first slide say conflict. But I don't know that it's always a place that we're ready to jump into. But let me just start by giving you just a little bit of information about the Colossian Forum. I had somebody send me a message on LinkedIn the other day that saw my profile and just say, "What? Could you tell me about the name of your organization? It's pretty unique." And so the Colossian Forum has been in existence for 13 years and has been doing the work of helping Christian leaders navigate conflict in hopeful, imaginative, and constructive ways. And that's not often how most of us have experienced conflict, or even like what stirs in us when we kind of feel conflict happening around us or in the space that we're occupying. But we try and make that shift from conflict as something we fear or try and avoid to something that we feel equipped to navigate, something that can actually produce some really positive things in our life and in the lives of others. And so we do this work through tools and training and coaching, with the North Star of our organization being love of God and love of neighbor. And so we can answer any questions. We'll tell you ways to find out more information, but that's just really a quick overview of who the Colossian Forum is and how we do the work. Just a brief introduction for each of us that are on the panel today. So as Erin said, my name is Jess Schultz. I'm the Chief Partnerships Officer here at the Colossian Forum. I have now worked here for almost 3 years. Before that, I served as a parish pastor for 18 years and was in the muck of it with many of you. And so that's really my why of why I do this work, and the privilege of getting to do it. Stacy Wieland is also on staff at the Colossian Forum. Stacy is the VP of Programming, Research, and Evaluation. She's been there about 5 years and comes from a career in higher education. And so that makes sense then when you think of developing program and doing research and evaluation. And then Andrea Nelson-Trice is the president of the Catalyst Research and is a friend of the Colossian Forum. We regularly work with Andrea and ask her to do evaluation for us, invite her into different projects. But it's also important for you to know she's not on staff, and she is an external researcher. And so believe me, she tells us the things that are hard to hear as she speaks with people, and we continue to learn as we do this work. Laura, if you can put up, we want to get a chance to get to know who's here and a little bit about you. And so we have a poll that we're going to ask you to respond to. And so if you just answer the questions here that pop up on the screen, that'll give us a chance to know who is here and what kind of perspectives you might be bringing. Stacy and Andrea, are there other things that you might want to add as you think about welcoming people and entering the space with them?
One of the things I would like people to know about why I do this work is that I'm married to a clergy person and have been walking alongside him in ministry. And part of what I've seen is that we can often think about conflicts in the church as purely about theological differences, but many of the conflicts that I've watched my spouse navigate in his role have been about just the challenges of doing ministry and mission together, the challenges around adapting to a new generation, to new generations, and remaining open and welcoming to new generations stirs up a lot of conflict in the churches that we've served. And so I just wanted to share that, as that our work is not just about big ideological or theological differences. It's really about some of those everyday things that emerge in doing ministry together.
Thanks, Stacy. Anything that you're thinking right now, Andrea, that you want to make sure people know?
I have been in church leadership as well, serving as an elder in the past. And yeah, I lived with some pretty heated conflict within the organization that I was part of. And just as serving as the external evaluator for 3 years now, I've had the privilege of listening to probably about 40 people in interviews, and then I've conducted some focus groups as well in Christian schools, in parishes, in just other nonprofit ministries where they have engaged with the Colossian Forum and done some of the training and then are working to implement it in their organizations. And you'll hear some of that as I share throughout the webinar. But the poignancy of conflict and what it can mean for an organization that has a beautiful vision and mission, but conflict has just erupted and it's not able to complete the mission as well as they would like to. It's real, and I've been a part of it as well.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. If we can see the poll results, that will help us know. So many of you are here connected to a church or a parish, some nonprofit, some college, some school. So thank you so much for being here, no matter your reason and your affiliation. Thanks too for putting your names and your roles in the chat. It's great to see those, to even have an idea of where across the country you all are coming from. Here's a quick roadmap for what we're going to cover over this time. And we want to encourage you to make sure that you stick around until the end, because we're going to give you a tool called a cost calculator, talk about that, and then let you know how we can provide a calculation of the cost of conflict in your particular organization. We'll also kind of save those questions that you might be putting in the chat, probably primarily for that end question and answer. And so we'll be able to respond to those then. Stacy, I'm particularly wondering, as we start, the Colossian Forum commissioned this report, this paper, trying to delve more into the cost of conflict. And why is it so important that we know that it's not just like, oh, there's a general sense that conflict is rampant in our lives, but why would we have commissioned this paper, and why does it seem so important for leaders to know this information?
We work with leaders who are weary and struggling with all manner of conflict, who are navigating tensions they're trying to hold in their parishes, who are working with vestries who just feel stuck, working with staff who have intractable conflicts that just linger. And we've experienced those things ourselves too. And we felt that trying to understand the cost of conflict and in as accurately as we could understand what the actual dollar and cents costs are for these organizations and leaders, it felt like it would help us really understand what's at stake. And I also want to be clear, we know there's so much more at stake than financial costs, right? But we wanted to be able to help leaders understand the financial costs in concrete ways. When we understand what's going on, when we can name it, when we can put numbers with it, it helps us to begin to do more about it. It helps motivate us to be able to say, do the hard work in the short term, because we can recognize those long-term impacts and costs that are having. So we're going to talk a lot today about economic costs of conflict for organizations, but also that Andrea will also talk a fair bit about some of the elements we can't quantify in our cost of conflict calculator, but we know the costs are large, and we felt that having a white paper that looks at the literature and looks at the research can help name people's experiences and validate and make them concrete in ways that can help them really motivate people to invest in doing the hard work in the short term to bring about change over time.
I think one of the things I'm really aware of is that we all have so many choices of how to use our time and what we're investing in as leaders. And oftentimes we kind of have to get on the balcony and with our leadership team discern what to invest in. And I think for some people, seeing the full cost helps make a case for that investment, or helps build a case if you have to kind of bring others on board for that as well. So we've used the word conflict a lot already. And so what do we mean when we talk about conflict in this kind of situation? When we say the cost of conflict, how are we defining conflict? What types of conflict are we taking a look at?
So in the paper, we focus on conflict, 3 types of conflict that tend to pop up in organizations. We talk about relationship conflict, task conflict, and process conflicts. Relationship conflicts is interpersonal conflicts, conflicts that sometimes stem from personality differences, but often are really related to values and norms that people hold that are different and that don't align. Task conflict would be conflicts related to questions about the work we should do and our goals for our work. What should our parish be pursuing as its goals in the next few years? That can cause all sorts of conflict. And then process conflicts have to do with how we move toward accomplishing those goals. So task conflict is what should the goals be. We often also engage conflict as we figure out how to make those things happen and how to do our work together. And so this paper, the white paper that we'll share a link with you to be able to access if you want to see the whole white paper, but it really focuses on the negative results of all 3 of these types of conflict. And it really emphasizes when we quantify it. Andrea will go through the negative results for individuals and teams, but we really emphasize the negative costs for organizations because those are the ones that are easier for us to quantify.
I'm really aware that sometimes when we think about conflict, especially in our current moment, we think about conflict as polarization, or we talk about large conflicts around theology, or those kinds of things. And those are things that do come under the umbrella of our work, and that the tools and the coaching and the trainings help one navigate. But there's also so many other of these conflicts that happen in our organizations. I think of the conflicts around having to navigate budgets. Often when we have less resources now than maybe we did 10 years ago, how do we select what programs and things that we're investing in when we have less volunteers than we used to? How do we respond to the demands of our donors or boards or students who are coming to our school, or the conflicts between maybe the donors and the board of an organization? And so the conflicts just broaden. And I would imagine, I want to just like slow us down enough for you all to think through what might be an example of a conflict that falls under relationship. What might be an example of a conflict that is a task or a process that you've experienced recently in your organizational life? And I'll just give 30 seconds for you to kind of to think. I want to make sure that we're not just talking about this out here, but there's this chance for you to draw a connection with your lived experience with what we're talking about.
And we're not going to ask you to share those.
Right.
Right? It's your own work.
I know that when I think about relationship conflicts, I think about the potential of conflict around just work rhythms. And say you're an early riser and you get into the office really early and get going, and your teammate might not. And the conflict around you feeling like they might not be working as hard as you, or the conflict around boundaries and availability, and what does that look like and balance in your life, or the tasks that we're called to do, and that in many of the places that we find ourselves in, it feels like we have 100 different bosses. In a lot of the organizations that you serve or work in, it's probably not super clear cut. Like, these are the 5 things that you're tasked to do, but there's multiple people trying to put those tasks on your list. I mean, competing values in that. And then the process of how we do that, the process of making decisions, who's at the table, different power dynamics, all of those things. Those are just a small sampling of the types of things that we're thinking about. And so, Andrea, as we think about conflict, we want to make sure that we're paying attention to the human impact that this has. That, again, it's not just an intellectual task that we're engaging in, but real people and real families that are impacted by these costs. And so, I wonder if you could tell us some specific negative impacts of conflict that were revealed in this study.
Yeah, so just to give a quick overview of where this data is coming from, I used published literature and peer-reviewed journals. A lot of it came from psychology and then the business realm. Some from really professional fields, like ombudsmen have their own journal, which had some interesting things in it. Christian organizations like Lifeway Research, Christianity Today magazine, they had done some research that you'll see in the white paper that'll be shared later. And then some organizations that are highly respectable, like KPMG, they have done their own research around conflict and the costs of it to organizations. So it's a variety of different reputable sources that I use to take a look at this. So at the human level, at the individual level, a lot of the research talks about depression and anxiety and inability to sleep. If you've lived through conflict, which all of us have, this is not news to you. I mean, this is just the reality of what it means to go into a workplace, go into a parish, and again feel like it's not safe. You're not understood. You don't understand somebody else and why they're taking such a hard stance on something that shouldn't be such a difficult situation. As part of my work as an external evaluator for the Colossian Forum, we have done pre-surveys of a number of different people, hundreds of people who have gone through the training that these guys offer. And a couple of themes came out from there that I think are worth sharing as well. One of them, in terms of conflict, it raises anger in people and impatience. Some people really get frustrated that we have to spend more time on this conflict again, or they feel a lot of guilt because they get angry far too quickly, far quicker than they want to, and then they have to go backpedal, ask for forgiveness. So there's some really negative emotions for some people around the existence of conflict in an organization, conflict that isn't being resolved in a timely manner. But then the most common theme that we heard from pre-survey, from the pre-survey before training, was fear. For a lot of people, fear around conflict, fear of saying the wrong thing when people are sitting around a table and trying to talk through a tough issue, fear of not being understood, fear of making things worse by actually having a conversation. So there is a lot of different things that people experience when they're experiencing conflict in an organization.
Andrea, what about effects on teams? What kinds of things did you see teams experiencing?
Yeah, so again, the research, and this is rather logical, when you have people who are stressed and anxious and frustrated and sometimes angry, it is not a good environment then to share vulnerabilities, whether it's let's brainstorm and everybody can throw out ideas that may not be fully baked. It's not the kind of environment where you're usually willing to do that, and research shows that. It's also not the environment where if you don't have all of the skills or the experience to do the task at hand that you're assigned, you're less likely to say, hey, could I have some help? Can I be vulnerable and say, I don't really know the best way forward? So it squelches creativity, it squelches collaboration, conflict that is unresolved, unaddressed, lowers trust. And interestingly, as I've talked with, again, a number of different people who are experiencing conflict in parishes, in Christian schools, and other ministries, and the training has not yet taken root in their organization. What I'm hearing people say also is, as a manager, I'm frustrated when people keep coming to me. They've got the tools now, but they keep coming to me instead of dealing with the conflict with the colleague with whom they have conflict. And then staff members saying, I'm really frustrated that my leader isn't taking the initiative to help us work through this. So all kinds of different dynamics happen at a team level when conflict just sits there and festers.
Yeah. So I think of even just that last example you gave, you have someone thinking one person is under functioning, and anytime you have an under functioning, you have an over functioning, and so the tension of that and the impact and the feelings of both of that, I think of how isolated individuals can start feeling, or feeling like I'm bearing this all on my own, and then the more isolated we get, the more we tell ourselves stories that might be really far from the truth. So we start making meaning of an experience, and then live out that meaning in that story. And that just continues to amplify the conflict and to lessen the health of the team. How about for organizations? What kind of impacts do you see for the organizations?
Again, this isn't, when you think about the process that's happening at the individual level and then the team level, it's not particularly surprising that at the organizational level, you have people who are talking with others about the conflict and they're not focusing on work at hand. I mean, so many of us externally process, need to get it out of our system. We're taking sides. We're just spending, it's a couple different studies have found that people on average, when there's conflict that's not being addressed in an organization, they'll spend about 3 hours a week just on the conflict. So it lowers productivity in a very clear, measurable way. People in surveys in multiple countries are saying, yeah, sometimes I just stay home. I just can't handle the conflict and I just don't go in. Or what is more prevalent and then for that reason more costly is presenteeism, where people show up to work, but they're so stressed, they're so fearful, angry, whatever the emotions are, but they're not doing work in the normal way. They're not as productive as normal. A study found that, a couple of different studies have found that when you ask people leaving an organization where conflict is rampant and not being worked through, about half of them said that the conflict that was unresolved was a major factor in why they left. And then not surprisingly, people are going to, we're humans. And so when we're dealing with this kind of stress from a volatile, or at least just an unpleasant environment, we often don't treat, whether it's parishioners, clients, whatever the term is in your organization, we don't treat them in the same way. We don't have the same patience. We don't have the same, sometimes, kindness. So the studies are showing that as well, that when people are asked in a pretty difficult situation in their organization, how is this affecting you? They're honestly saying, I am not as good with the people that I'm working with outside of the organization. I'm just not as patient.
Yeah, and I think as I hear you say that, we all want our organizations to be reliable in such a way that love of God and love of neighbor is our North Star. And we want people to have a sense of belonging. We want them to experience grace and acceptance for where one is at. And the more that this reality of conflict pushes against that, the harder it is for us to be reliable, for us to act as Jesus would want us to act. And so then we have these impacts on our system that that matter deeply to us. I think if any one of us had someone say, this is how I'm experiencing the organization, and it's other than what our mission and our vision and our values are, that just like shoots through our core. And yet, as you're saying, what the research shows, this is the kind of impact on human beings from the level of conflict that we're experiencing in all kinds of ways. All right, so we're going to shift and we're going to do our second poll now because we're curious as we move to talk about the real costs of conflict. What are you thinking are the costs associated with these negative effects? As people are filling that out, Andrea, I'm curious what maybe has been surprising? What did you find in the research that you thought, I never would have imagined that this was here?
Just it really is very much related to what you were just talking about. When in a couple of different studies, nonprofits talked about, like people in nonprofits talked about conflict being far more common than in any other sector, whether that was catering or the marketing field or what, all these different sectors of industry. And it was nonprofits where they were more likely to say conflict is occurring, that's not being resolved, and it's really affecting me. And as I think about it, and I don't know, but I think part of it is what you're saying, Jess, is that we join a congregation, we join a ministry with the hope of helping to carry out a beautiful mission that we really feel passionate about. And when conflict that isn't even about the mission, it's not really about the goals, it's about, style or whatever the issue is, personality differences, when that takes front stage and we're spending so much time on that on a weekly and monthly basis, rather than really working together to do something that we alone could not do, at least in the same way, it gets us to the core. It isn't just frustrating. It's like, wait a minute, this is my calling and I can't do it because of this conflict that won't end. So that to me was, it makes sense, I think, assuming that my story makes sense, but the actual reality that studies are showing nonprofits are dealing with conflict far more frequently than other sectors was surprising to me.
Yeah, thanks. That's disheartening in so many ways, I think. And often when we talk about conflict as opportunity, we talk about it as an opportunity for discipleship. So working on our own formation to create a different reality. But then we also talk about conflict as opportunity for witness. And so I think about the importance of that witness within our organizations and then externally as well. What are our neighborhoods and our communities also experiencing? And so if they're experiencing these heightened levels of conflict that the research is showing exists in these organizations, that most definitely harms our witness. So let's see the poll results. All right. Yeah, so spread out quite a bit there. So Andrea, let's move to how did you calculate the actual cost when you started trying to get to the numbers?
Again, this is all research based. So it is not my own research. It is published research that's out there. And because businesses in general want to know what is this cost that we're allowing ourselves to bear. There's a fair amount of research out there. And so it's all published studies that we used to pull this together and to say, okay, if we look at, and it's mostly at the organizational level. If we look at turnover, if we look at lower productivity because of conflict, what does it do to an organization?
Yeah. So if we go to the next slide, it starts seeing some of those really specifics.
Yep.
So why don't you share a little bit about that?
Yeah. So what research shows, and I've mentioned some of these already, some of the studies already, is that a couple different studies show we're spending, when there's conflict that isn't being addressed, about 3 hours a week on the conflict that's not moving any way forward. It's just spending it on the conflict and the churning that happens. Absenteeism, there are costs obviously associated if people don't come to work because the conflict has gotten so bad and they're so sleep deprived, but it doesn't even have to be that bad of a conflict. I mean, people can just say, it's just wearing me down. And it's not that I'm not sleeping, but I'm just frustrated with it. I just need a personal day. I need a day off. There was an interesting study done that asked people, not so much around conflict, but just around what is it like at work when you don't come at full speed, at full steam? And what are some of the common maladies that you're experiencing? It was an interesting study, but so they looked at, I think, about 30 different maladies that people said they often come with it to work. And what I did was to overlap those maladies with the ones that at the individual level, research is showing, yep, depression, anxiety, sleep deprivation, those things are happening when there's conflict. So there are costs then. The study looked at, okay, what happens with your work when you are feeling this way? When you're depressed, what happens to your work? And so it's an interesting quantified look at when people are feeling depression, what happens to their productivity. And then employee turnover, again, you can, through exit interviews, get some really good data. People are often quite honest at that point about what caused them to leave. And then looking at the costs of recruiting people and interviewing and then hiring and training and bringing them up to speed. It is a very expensive process to replace, especially professional leaders within an organization. And then when conflict happens, I mean, for those of us that have been a part of congregations, we know members don't want on a Sunday to go and enter into conflict. I'll worship alone. I'll worship somewhere else. I'm not going to enter into this. So maybe not huge amounts of people, but certainly there's data that says, and just our own experiences say, people leave when conflict goes on and starts to become the focal point of gathering. And then unfortunately, especially when there are specific employee issues going on, legal fees come to bear. And so there are studies around what are average legal fees when an organization is embroiled in a conflict and people, whether it's arbitration, mediation, or actually a lawsuit that's filed, there are common legal fees. So that's a part of the cost of conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. As you were doing these calculations, are you assuming an unhealthy conflict culture? And would the calculations be different if there's a healthier conflict culture? Before you answer, I want to just say a little bit about the ways that we are defining healthy conflict cultures.
Mm-hmm.
And so we talk about a conflict culture can lean in the direction of being defensive. And so that's the posture that many people are showing up, or that's the feel of the organization. Or organization can be avoidant. We're going to just keep shoving things under the rug. We're going to maybe be aware of something and come up with a simple solution, or we're just not going to respond at all. And so some conflict cultures are more avoidant. The goal, or when we say healthy, we're thinking collaborative. And no organization has only one. All of us have different aspects of that are part of this. But when you're doing these calculations, is it the kind of experience that only organizations that are really, really avoidant or really, really defensive or combative have a cost of conflict?
No, and I'm, all of these different voices are going through my minds from the focus groups and the interviews that I've done in service to you guys to help continue to improve the training and the materials that you have for people. It doesn't have to be this all-encompassing, horrific, school splitting, church splitting topic. I mean, it can just be this daily grind where we just don't talk about stuff. We just keep putting things away, or, it isn't safe to talk. And so one person makes the decision. And so the assumptions, as I was doing the calculations, and I tried to be very clear with the assumptions throughout in the paper, but I assumed that the conflict involved every member of the organization, like employed member. It produced negative outcomes that weren't being addressed, and then it had lasted for at least a year, which may sound like a long time, but boy, in the interviews that I've done, that's not at all uncommon for, for an issue just to sit, and for a culture just to function in a way that doesn't move forward with conflict. It just, allows for side taking and kind of camps to be built where people are on one side or the other and not really working toward common understanding and love for each other.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So we've been looking at the calculations. Stacey, I wonder if you can share with us what kind of value does this tool have?
Yeah, thanks for asking. We see this tool having a calculation for the cause of conflict being helpful in a variety of ways. We talk with leaders who experience this, and having the white paper that points to the literature that names the same things that they have experienced can be very legitimizing. It helps them understand they're not alone, that they're not the only ones who have experienced these really challenging things that are making ministry and life in congregations difficult. So that's a first benefit, is looking to the research and trying to understand the very real impacts that conflict has on individuals, on teams, and on organizations or parishes can help understand that the problem's bigger than your own individual context. It can also really help you understand what's at stake. We work with leaders, and knowing what's at stake, looking at the research rather than simply drawing on their own intuition, becomes leverage to be able to say, we've got to find a different way. If you're going to shift the conflict culture of an organization, one person alone cannot do that. They need to help others see the need for that change and help motivate others to make that change. So one of the things that's very helpful is, having research-based findings that say this isn't just us, and there's something we can do about it, which is what the white paper also demonstrates based on the research, is that by investing in new ways, by engaging in conflict training, by working together to shift the conflict culture, we can bring about change. But these aren't Band-Aids, these aren't quick fixes. And so the white paper and the cost of conflict calculator can help motivate and bring people on board to be willing to invest in the long work that needs to happen to change these conflict cultures in churches.
So in a follow-up email that you'll get the link to request this kind of evaluation and to get a report for your organization. And we realize that's helpful in some places, and it's not helpful. Some organizations are ready to jump into the work, and some experience some resistance, especially when I would say there's a recognition in many organizations to do this work. But what the difference is that many organizations are looking for a quick fix, like spend an hour with us and then it's all going to change. And the thing that we're really clear about is, for organizational change, it requires many different interventions over time, and kind of making a commitment to this work for a period of time. And so we realize that this is just one piece, and is helpful for some and not always helpful for others. And so you've heard us today talk a lot about what conflict might really be costing you. And then we also want to make sure that you see that conflict also is an opportunity. I think about the kind of motivation around the first of the year, maybe to make some New Year's resolutions, and why? Because we're all feeling really gross after the kind of food that we ate from the holidays, and so sometimes to make the commitment to do hard work, we have to be aware of the pain and be aware of what we're experiencing. But the reality is that conflict can be an opportunity. It can be an opportunity for personal growth and formation, for better collaboration, for increased satisfaction, increased flexibility, increased trust, and deeper love. And those are the things that our tools and our training and our resources really help you be able to accomplish. So here on the screen is just some ways that you can get access to these resources. We're going to send you the link to the report, as well as a way to experience the cost calculator. We have a newsletter that gives practices and stories and prayers and different ways to begin to engage this work. And then we have a podcast as well. And those are all things that you can access anytime to help encourage a constructive conflict culture. And then we'd also love to hear if you're interested in finding out more about exactly how we do the work, and experiencing some of those practices through workshops or things like that. And we can answer some of those questions too in the chat to see what specific questions at this point that you might have.
I didn't advance us into the actual numbers that Andrea had calculated, so I just want to take us back to look at that. We looked at the what the different things in the conflict calculator would be, but just to give you a sense, Andrea, do you want to talk us through it all, the numbers on the right?
Yeah, so and all of these numbers, I really took a conservative approach. So there's research that says this is how much it costs an organization of this size. And so I took a conservative approach when there were questions like if different studies show different things, or if different, average salaries varied based on the study. So these numbers, while huge, I think, are actually fairly conservative. And so for a church that has 5 staff members, just the time on conflict is $17,000 a year, over $17,000 a year, because of time that they're not spending pursuing the mission of the organization, but instead just on the conflict. And you can go through here and see when there's like a loss of members in the congregation, what that means in terms of giving. And so it's based on the number of staff, and as part of this is what leads into then the cost calculator that both Jess and Stacy have talked about, where you can put in your own size of organization and get a sense of what it actually costs each year for conflict that is not addressed in a healthy way.
Thanks, Andrea.
One of the things is, as Jess was talking, again, all of the different people that I've interviewed and run focus groups with who have gone through this training, we talk about what it does to the organization, but I think the spiritual formation that happens as a result of learning how to engage in conflict in a scriptural way is so powerful. And there are just so many people that I've spoken with and listened to their stories, and who have shared about, the deeper relationships that they have in the organization, and just a sense of greater control over anger that they had, less guilt and shame that they're not dealing with anymore, because they're dealing with conflict in a healthy way, in a biblical way. It's spread for individuals to their families and how they engage in conflict in their homes, in their Bible studies. People have talked about, I'm in this small group, and using these tools has helped us to go deeper. So it isn't just like organization within a building. The beauty of using scriptural principles to address conflict in what is often in America a very countercultural way, is the beauty of it is phenomenal. And I have been in a position to listen to story after story of what that can mean.
Yeah. One of the questions in the chat is if we can talk about managing conflict. And one of the things that I'm really aware of is there's a way to manage and engage conflict where we're doing so to get a certain outcome. And often addressing conflict that way can lead to us not actually living out our values and our commitments in ways that Christ would want us to. So we talk about the fruit of the Spirit. We talk about the virtues that need to be cultivated in us: generosity, hospitality, humility, hope, courage, forbearance. And so we want to not just think that we have to end the conflict or we have to resolve the conflict, but how we get to that point matters just as much. And so some of the things that we talk about is the necessity to slow down, to pay attention to what is urgent and what is false urgency. I think about a simple practice of, if an email comes into you and you feel yourself really stirred up, and you're tempted to respond, to slow down, to practice a 24-hour rule, and to let people know that that's your rule so that they're not just thinking you're ignoring them, and be able to slow it down enough and then respond based on our values, of love of God and love of neighbor. Maybe slowing down means somebody else can take a look at your response. Maybe slowing down means you need to invite that person to have a real live conversation. And so when we talk about the work that we do, we talk about doing it under the umbrella of Christian conflict transformation, which is a process that pays attention to how we're going about this work, no matter the end result, no matter the policy statement that we make, no matter the decision we make, no matter what our next steps are, and that we want to follow Jesus in the midst of that. Is there something else that you would say about that question, Stacy?
I really appreciate what you offered. You made me think about just the value of when we help people learn to slow down, of just asking about the next faithful step and doing one step at a time. Oftentimes, I think the desire for a particular outcome, or perhaps ending the conflict because we're uncomfortable with it, can lead us to try and plan many steps ahead and try and have control by doing that. And so when we are following the Spirit, we ask about the next faithful step, and we hold back on planning too far in advance and knowing too much about what will happen from there, and trust that God will continue to reveal each faithful step as we go. So that is a framing that we find resonates well with leaders, and is a good example of the connection between Scripture and our deep commitments as Christians, and then how we actually navigate conflict, not necessarily the end, but the process by which we do so.
I'm also really aware of how easy it is for us in today's world to feel like we have zero agency, that so much is just happening to us. And one of the things that we rely heavily on is family systems and systems, the organizational systems work. And part of that is starting with growing self-awareness, of recognizing what do you actually have agency to do within yourself. And so to learn our own default reactions in the midst of conflict, to grow our own emotional maturity, which is not something totally other than our spiritual maturity, and to grow that in our organizations, is all part of the work, and are things that prove or have been proven to shift the needle as well, and to create different systems. I see another question here. Could you address the roles of clergy and vestry in managing conflict, both internal and external? Stacy, do you have a response, or you want me to share some?
If you have a starting place you want to go, that's fine. I do have some thoughts, but go ahead.
Yeah, I think that I think it's a place that is important to recognize what are the norms and the practices in your church polity, and then to test those against the potential of how that polity could be really helpful and how it could be abused or misused. And so, as many of you are aware of, making sure that that the polity and the systems and structures set up denominationally, there's a reason for that, and that they're used for that reason, versus bullying or using power in a way that it's not intended. I think one of the things that when we work with clergy and vestries, we would want to talk through ways to earn trust. And what has the story been, and the experience of a parish up until that point. And so how do you either continue to live into that trust and not break that trust, or how do you grow it, or loop back and do some repair work, for things that have been done. And the same thing with clergy. Oftentimes clergy is are connected to the person that came before them and the person that comes after. And so paying attention to what is in the system around that. Communication is so key. I certainly remember as I was serving as a parish pastor, that I would think I communicated something, and I did. But my training isn't in communication. And so I didn't realize it needed to happen, 5 times or 7 times for everything. And so I think also recognizing in our fields of study and in our preparation for the roles that we have, what else do we need to learn, in humility, as well? What else might you say, Stacy?
I was thinking about some of the things you said, but I was also thinking about just the importance for clergy and vestry to have a shared sense of their values and commitments to how conflict will be handled before. And maybe there's never a before, because there's always conflicts that are live at any given moment. But it's important to take some time to do work outside of a particular heated situation, to think about what are our commitments, what are the values, what are the ways of being that we want to inhabit together. Because then we are all going to mess up, and we are all going to fall short of a vision we have, a shared commitment we have. But then we can invite each other back to it rather than be calling each other out for bad behavior. So it helps us to set a foundation upon which to operate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another person wrote that micromanaging and bullying are 2 issues that are in some work cultures. One of the tools that we will use with an organization is called an organizational flourishing instrument or survey. And the thing that I'm aware of is that oftentimes there needs to be a way to have some shared understanding that micromanaging and bullying are happening in a system. And so one of the ways that those realities could get surfaced would be from taking this type of survey, staff, key leaders, and it allows in a safe way, in an anonymous way, to surface that reality in your organization. And then that allows that to be at the forefront and be a real reality that is being dealt with in the training and in coaching. Because my guess is, or my hope, and kind of what I've experienced is that whoever is practicing those realities is not doing that intentionally. Maybe that is the case sometimes. But there needs to be oftentimes some kind of way to name that in the system that doesn't require someone to have a one-on-one confrontation, especially if that is somebody that is a person in power or the risk is really hard. So that's one of the ways that in the work that we do, we surface that reality. So then we can offer some tools and do some work around that. I'm just taking a look to see if there are other questions. Stacy, do you see other questions?
Well, I just really appreciate Patty's example and advice that she's learned from her work life around feedback, being very specific and descriptive and not generic is so important when we're trying to help people understand how they're being perceived and what is helpful and what is harmful. Feedback is a gift, and that's one of the things that the organizational flourishing survey that Jess just mentioned often surfaces is irregular rhythms of feedback. The feedback literature says if it's only once a year that people are getting any feedback on how they're doing and how they're being perceived, it's not frequent enough. It needs to be an ongoing conversation and not just when the stakes are high in an annual review. So that's one of the things we repeatedly see in the results of different parishes, is that there aren't always good rhythms of feedback, and there aren't always good practices that are descriptive in the way that Patty described, so that people can build trust and start to make changes. It's hard to make changes if you've ever received feedback that's negative, that's been very unhelpful and unspecific. It can breed distrust and frustration and cause more problems than help.
Yeah. And Patty also noted the importance of emotional intelligence, which I think we had mentioned is woven through the training and the work that we're doing. And the reason for is that all of the trends are saying that high school students are growing with graduating with lower and lower levels of emotional intelligence. That as a culture that is diminishing. And so as people walk into your organization, as you hire staff, as you try and work together as a team, that's all part of your reality. And while we maybe can name it or we feel that, we don't always have ways to grow that. And so if that's part of the systems and structures that can be part of the norms in your system, that also plays into this. We just want to thank all of you for your time today. In the email follow-up, you'll have access to a lot of these other tools and other ways to find out more about the practices and the way that we do this work. But thank you for your time today.